Psalm 53 is the Song of the Fool, and it is almost identical to an earlier psalm, Psalm 14. You may want to turn back and read that psalm. It has an additional verse that this psalm does not have, and there are at least a few word changes between the two, but the general thrust and idea and thought of the two psalms is the same. And that may bring up a question in your mind. You may ask, well, if they're basically the same, then why do we have both of them? Why isn't one of them sufficient? God in His wisdom saw the need to give us both. Some things bear repeating. And certainly they bear repeating for those who are prone to ignore them. And that would be the case with the fool. The fool is hard of hearing. He is resistant to truth and to wisdom. And so in order to get through to him, you may have to tell him more than once. You may have to stress it over and over again. And so sometimes the Bible does that. Sometimes it does it in the same book. Sometimes it does it within the very same context. For example, in Luke chapter 13, verses 3 and 5, we have the exact same words. I tell you, nay, but except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. And it's repeated just 2 verses later. And so God sometimes sees the need to remind us of things that we could have forgotten. If you look at Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 6, you'll see that it is the nature of those who are foolish to ignore things that are said. In 17 and verse 16, it says, Wherefore is there a price in the hand of a fool to get wisdom, seeing he hath no heart to it? He has no interest in it. He has no desire to learn these things. And so they're going to be hard to teach. There are subjects that some of us like better than others. And when we like a subject, then it's easier to teach us that subject. There were certain subjects in school that I really enjoyed, and I wanted to go to that class, and I wanted to read what was assigned, and I wanted to learn what was being taught. But then there were other classes I wasn't interested in. They were not things that seemed to be practical to me. They were not things that I found value in, and therefore it was very hard to learn them, and very hard for someone to teach them to me. And maybe you're that way as well. That's the case here with the fool, because the fool has no heart, he has no interest in it. It's very hard to teach him. Notice Proverbs 18 and verse 2, A fool hath no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself. He's not interested in learning anything. He just wants to tell you what he knows. He's not interested in gaining understanding or gaining wisdom. We've all been in the class with someone who didn't want to listen to the teacher. They just wanted to make comments. They just wanted to tell what they knew rather than to learn something new. Perhaps we've even been in Bible classes like that. This class doesn't lend itself to that, and that's one of the advantages to a class like this. It's big enough to where it's very hard to do that. It has to be a lecture class almost by default because of the size of the class and the nature of it. But sometimes, and we've all been in these classes, when there's smaller classes, maybe 15 or 20 people meeting in a smaller room, sometimes it is a pooling of foolishness. Everybody just makes their comment, and everybody, even those who have not prepared for that study, even those who have not studied the lesson, will offer a comment about it. And everyone gives their take on whatever it is. And time is taken up without really digging in or getting very much out of the study. Proverbs 23 and verse 9, another passage that talks about the fool, it says, Speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of thy words. Don't speak into his ears. Don't tell him, because he really doesn't want to know. And he may even end up despising you because you did tell him. Proverbs 24 and verse 7 says, Wisdom is too high for a fool. He openeth not his mouth in the gate. It's too high for him. It's too high for him because he doesn't want it. If you want something, you'll find a way to get up to it. But he doesn't want it, and therefore he doesn't put the effort forth in order to get it. That's the nature of what we're talking about in Psalm 53 when we talk about this man the Bible calls a fool. This psalm needs to be repeated because some have not heeded, have not learned the message of it. As we take a look at Psalm 53, we want to see three things. First of all, we want to see the folly of atheism. The folly of atheism. And we will see that it denies the undeniable. We want to see the fruits of atheism. And we'll see that it does the unthinkable. And then finally, we want to see the future of atheism. And we'll see that it damns the unteachable. Let's begin by noticing the folly of atheism. In Psalm 53 and verse 1, the psalmist says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." The fool hath said in his heart. Three things we need to notice about this. First of all, we need to notice who said it. We need to know what is said, and finally where it is said. The person who says this is described by the Bible as the fool. That's not my description of him. That's not your description of him. That's not some other man's description of him, but rather that is God's description of him. We, of course, have to be very careful in calling someone a fool. Matthew chapter 5 pronounces a very serious warning on us, even in using that word or in referring to someone in that way. But God is not so limited. God can call anyone that he wants to a fool. And he on occasion does. And this is one of those occasions. We see what is said, and that is that there is no God. And finally, we see where it is said, and it is said in his heart. The word fool comes from a Latin word that means bellows. It is the idea that this is a man who is full of hot air. Remember, we've already noticed that the fool likes to tell you what he knows, but he doesn't want to learn what you are trying to teach him. And so he is full of hot air. And certainly the man in this psalm fits that description. Fools are known for their talking. In fact, many times in the book of Proverbs, we see that Solomon describes the fool and what the fool has to say, because fools are always uttering their minds. Notice Proverbs chapter 18 in verses 6 and 7, and you'll see this description of the fool. Proverbs chapter 18 in verses 6 and 7. It says, "A fool's lip enter into contention, and his mouth calleth for strokes. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul." And so this is what leads to his destruction, the fact that he talks rather than listens. Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 11. Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 11. "A fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it in till afterwards." A fool tells you everything. He keeps nothing in. He says everything that he knows. And of course, as this psalm will tell us, he doesn't know very much. But he tells you what he thinks he knows. The fool denies the existence of God. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Evidently, the fool does not come out and declare this with his lips, but it is nonetheless what he believes in his heart. It is what he demonstrates in his life. He may not be bold enough to declare it, but nonetheless he is an unbeliever. Now, when you look at this psalm, you'll see that the words "there is" are italicized. That means that they are supplied for the purpose of understanding. But let's remove those words. The fool hath said in his heart, no God. Strengthens it a little bit, perhaps, when we leave those two words out. The fool says in his heart, no God. He does not believe in the existence of God. He does not acknowledge a supreme being over his life. Now, it's interesting that the atheist does not deny his own existence. He believes that he exists. And that is at least a starting point in talking to him about his existence. Since he believes that he exists, that begs the question, how did you get here? Where did you come from? You're here. You acknowledge that you're here. You exist. You acknowledge your existence. Where did you come from? How did you get here? It begs the question, doesn't it? It gives us the opportunity to show that there is design in the way that He's made. Is there any camera that can compare to the human eye? No. The camera was designed after the human eye. If you think about the shutter, you think about the eyelid closing and opening, and you think about the ability to focus a great distance or up close, and you think about the ability of the eye very quickly to adjust to different light and different settings, there's no camera that can compare to that. Oh, there are some fantastic cameras out there. In fact, the technology is amazing. If you purchased a camera within the last 5 years, then you know what I'm talking about. We live in the age of digital cameras. Used to, you buy a digital camera and it was bulky and big. Now you can buy a digital camera that's half the size of that old one, but has a great deal more ability than that old one in a smaller package. And yet still, we've not come close to the design that's inherent in the human eye. Oh, if there's design, there must have been a designer. That begs the question, who was that designer? The only logical answer for how we came to be is that someone had to make us. Chance, it's not logical. Blind chance, not logical. A big bang, it's not logical. You don't get order from disorder. There has to be a logical answer to how we got here. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4 says, every house is builded by some man, and he that built all things is God. Now there's a logical answer for how we came to be here. We owe our existence to God. Notice Romans chapter 1 and verses 20 through 22. Romans chapter 1 and verses 20 through 22. You'll see that this issue of unbelief, this issue of atheism is not a new issue. It existed in David's day, it existed in Paul's day, and yes, it exists in our day. In Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 20, Paul would say, for the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Remember, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Now notice in verse 20 it says, the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. It doesn't say they are dimly seen. It doesn't say that they are barely seen. Have you ever followed any of these reports of the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot or any of these things? And sometimes they'll say, we've got a picture. You ever looked at one of those pictures? You know, they believe that some of the pictures of the Loch Ness Monster were probably logs in the water. They were fuzzy. They're hard to make out. You can't really determine what they are. Perhaps the pictures have even been doctored or edited to create a certain effect. That's not what Paul says about the existence of God. He says it's clearly seen. You see, we're just not out here making an educated guess. No, it's clearly seen. It's obvious. And notice he says in the last part of verse 20, so that they are without excuse. Without excuse. Those that appear before God on the day of judgment, who have not believed in the existence of God, will on that day be without excuse. They will not be able to say, as Bertrand Russell did, there simply wasn't enough evidence. The evidence is overwhelming. It's clearly seen. They are without excuse. A Russian cosmonaut one time came back from space. And he declared that while he was out in space, that he looked for God, and he looked very carefully for God, but didn't see Him. And someone commented that if he had opened the door of his space capsule, he would have met God. And that's true. You know, we as human beings do not have the ability to be everywhere at the same time. In fact, we don't have the ability to be everywhere, even in the course or the space of our lifetimes. And how arrogant it is for us to declare God does not exist, when we have not been everywhere and we have not seen everything, but we will declare that He does not exist in spite of that. You know, the battleground of atheism is mentioned right here within this psalm, and I want you to understand that. It's very important for you to understand. The fool hath said, in his heart. You know, that's the battleground, isn't it? That's what we're after. That's what we have to win if we're going to win men for Christ. We're going to have to win their hearts. We're going to have to convince their minds. That's the battleground. In 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 4, the Bible says that the devil hath blinded the minds of those that believe not, lest at any time the light of the glorious gospel should shine unto them, and they should be converted. The devil blinds the minds. He blinds the hearts of those who don't believe. The devil understands that the battleground is the heart, and he understands that if he can blind men's hearts, then they never will obey the truth. And atheism has been a leading cause of blindness in our nation and in our world. The heart is the battleground. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 37, you remember the Ethiopian eunuch? He said to Philip, see, here is water. What doth hinder me from being baptized? Remember what Philip said? If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. The battleground was the heart. The battleground was whether or not the eunuch would believe what Philip had preached with all of his heart. If he would not believe it with all of his heart, then he was not ready to be baptized. You see, Christianity is not 60-40. It isn't the idea that there's slightly more evidence for the existence of God than there is that God doesn't exist. No, it's not that way at all. I had a Bible study with a young man one time, and we went through the open Bible study, which is a good approach, and we went through every part of it, and we got down to the point to where we were beginning to encourage him to do what he had learned to do to be baptized. He said, I got to ask you about something. He said, do I have to believe that the world was created in 6 24-hour days in order to be baptized? Well, that seemed to come out of nowhere. We hadn't had a discussion or argument about anything we'd said up to that point. Here was a person who would tell you, I believe in the existence of God. I'm just not sure God did it the way He said He did it. Can I be baptized anyway? Well, he said, no, you're not ready to be baptized. You're not ready to be baptized because of what we're talking about right here. It's not a 60-40 kind of proposition. It is you either believe it or you don't. You either accept the existence of God, you accept that God did what He said He did in the way that He said to do it, that He did it, or you don't. There's no room for hedging. There's no room for doubting. You see, the battleground is the heart, and you have to believe it with all your heart. If there's a corner of your heart that's reserved for something else or someone else, then you're not ready to be baptized into Christ. But let's think about something else as we think about the folly of atheism. Let's talk about the fruits of atheism. That begins in verse 2. Actually, the last part of verse 1. It says, corrupt are they, and have done abominable iniquity. There is none that doeth good. Corrupt are they. Here are the fruits of atheism. The folly of atheism is in claiming that there is no God, in denying the clear evidence that exists all around us. But the fruits of atheism are corruption, iniquity, and no good. Corrupt is used 4 times in the book of Genesis to describe the world before the flood. If you remember anything about Genesis chapter 6 and the way the world is described, it's described as being corrupt. That's the very idea here. The man who denies the existence of God, what will be the fruits of that type of thinking, of that type of teaching? Well, it will be a corrupt society. It will be a corrupt person. It will be a person who will be guilty of abominable iniquity. That's what you get from that kind of thinking, from that kind of teaching. There are a lot of people that would suggest that atheism is harmless and that it ought to be left alone. Atheism is not harmless. You read this psalm and tell me that atheism is harmless. No, atheism produces corruption. Atheism produces abomination. Atheism is the cause of evil, but not of good. Why do we have the problems that we have in society today? Is it because of the teaching of the Bible? Can you blame the teaching of the Bible on the problems of society? No. Can you blame the teaching of evolution for the problems of society? The Bible elevates man. It tells us that man's made in the image of God. And it stresses that man should be God-like in his behavior. Contrast that with the teaching of evolution. Man's not made in the image of God, but rather man has evolved from animals. And is it surprising that men who believe that philosophy, who imbibe that teaching, then many times display animal-like behavior in the way that they conduct their lives? Sometimes we describe people as living like animals, and they are. But they've been told now for how long that they are but descendants of animals, and that nature is within them. Abominable iniquity, the basis of sins, spring from atheism. You look at the evil that's been done in the world, and you look at the godless system that is so often behind it. We have to judge atheism by the fruit that it produces. And the fruit that it produces is not commendable. Notice as well in verse 2, he says, God looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand, that did seek God. God looks down. Maybe the atheist won't look up, but God will look down. Maybe the atheist won't see God, but God sees him. There's a book that's been written by Ken Blanchard. He's an English gentleman, and he wrote a book entitled, Does God Believe in Atheists? And the answer, of course, is yes. Atheists don't believe in God, but God believes in them. In fact, God describes them, talks about them in this very psalm. God looks down on them even though they don't look up on Him. But God looks down to see if there were any that did understand. Any that wanted to know, literally. God's looking down from heaven and God is viewing His creation and God says, is there anyone who wants to know? Because the atheist doesn't want to know. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 28, if you'll notice that passage, we'll see the attitude of the atheist, and it is the attitude of the fool, and that's why God so describes him. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 28, it says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. They didn't like to have God in their knowledge. They didn't want to know God. They rejected any knowledge of God. Notice that God's looking down to see if any did seek Him. But the fool isn't searching for God. He doesn't want to find God. In fact, he's doing everything he can to keep from finding God. For if he finds God, then he would have to submit to God. Billy Sunday used to say that sinners can't find God for the same reason that criminals can't find a policeman. They aren't looking for Him. And it's true. Men who are looking for God, they can find God. It's only those who aren't looking for God, who don't want to find Him, who have difficulty doing that. Do you remember, and I remember this, maybe you weren't like this, but I can remember that there were times when I was growing up when Dad would send me to get my own switch. Now that's the ultimate punishment there. When you know you're in trouble and you know you're going to get a spanking, and your dad sends you to find your own switch. And you better not come back with just a little one either, or one that didn't have anything about it, because if you did, then he would go get one, and he would overcompensate for what you failed to do. Think about that. Think about going and getting your own switch. Well, you'd go to seek one, and there were times when you come back and say, I just can't find one. They're just not there. You know why I couldn't find one? You know why you couldn't find one growing up? Because we didn't want to find one. We were hoping there wasn't one. But you know, Dad never had trouble finding one. He could always find one. Think about as well as we look at this. It says in verse 3, every one of them is gone back. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Every one of them is gone back. Now Psalm 14 says they've gone aside. They've gone astray. But this psalm says they've gone back. You know, man's life ought to be about seeking God. It ought to be about coming to God. But the atheist life is about running from God. It's about going in the opposite direction. It's about going backward rather than forward. Have you ever thought you were in forward and you were really in reverse? You ever done that? You stepped on the gas and all of a sudden you were headed in the wrong direction. The atheist, that's what he's doing. He's going the wrong direction. And he's a danger to himself and he's a danger to others as a result of that. God talked about His people in Isaiah 1 and verse 4 as going backwards. He did the same thing in Jeremiah 7 and verse 24. He says here that they are altogether become filthy. Filthiness is a fruit of atheism. The word filthy is a word that means stinking. And it refers to milk that has spoiled. Have you ever opened a gallon of milk and smelled of it and realized that it was out of date? What did you want to do with that? You couldn't wait till you put it as far away from you as you could. Those are the fruits of atheism, that which is to be put away. Those who believe this way, according to this psalm, they don't do good. Someone has noted the atheists don't build hospitals. And that's true. Atheists, because of the nature of what they believe, tend to be self-serving. and materialistic, because that's what life for them is about. This is all that there is. Notice in verse 4, have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread? They have not called upon God. God says, have they no knowledge? It isn't that they don't have knowledge, it's that they don't want knowledge. They're fools. They reject knowledge. They eat up my people as they eat up bread. They are the enemies of Christianity and of those who believe in God. But in verses 5 and 6, we move from the fruits of atheism to talk about the future of atheism. It says in verse 5, there were they in great fear where no fear was. Atheists tend to be very bold in this life, and they tend to very boldly proclaim there is no God. One day they will be in fear. For God hath scattered the bones of him that encampeth against thee. Thou hast put them to shame. They don't seem to have any shame now, but God one day will put them to shame. Because God hath despised them, God has rejected them. You remember what Jesus said? He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that rejecteth him. They've rejected God here. One day God will reject them there. They're unashamed now, but they will be ashamed then. They're bold now, but they won't be bold then. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess. But I want you to think about something that maybe sometimes we don't bring out. And that's in verse 6. Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion. When God bringeth back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. You know, one of the saddest things for the atheist will one day be the fact that the Christians were right. Atheists have such a hatred for believers today. But one day believers will be vindicated, and they will be rejected. And they will realize in that day that they had the opportunity to lay hold on the hope of salvation, but refused to do so. Oh, how hard that will be when they will realize that they've spent their life running away from God, only ultimately to have to stand before him and face him. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.